Today I'm going to teach you how to make one of my favorite beginning cheese recipes for a cheese that you can age, or a cheese that you can press, or also a cheese that you can do interesting treatments to the rind to make it have interesting characteristics. That cheese is Monterey Jack. It's a cheese recipe that comes from this area of California, so it's got some historical roots. And to get it going, I have my tools. They've been freshly steamed and cleaned, as well as my pot. It's nice and clean. And I have my milk ready. The next step is I'm going to go ahead and add my milk, just straight from the refrigerator, so it's really quite cold. Put it into the pot. To do that, I could daringly pour it in, that's fine. Just to be safe, I'm going to ladle it in for the first few bits to make sure I don't splash it too much. That brings up an interesting point though. When I'm putting milk into the pot, I don't want to do like an Indian chai where I'm doing a nice long pour, get a lot of froth. That's really not good for cheese making. What's good for cheese making is that the milk stays in its as natural a state as possible, so that the milk stays as close to it was when it came out of the cow or goat or buffalo or sheep as possible. That means I don't want to break it and froth it and interrupt it when I pour it. So sometimes if I'm being super careful, I'll even tilt the pot and pour the milk in. Think about when you pour a beer and you don't want to have too much frothy head on the top, same idea. So I'll go ahead and put all this milk in, and then we'll start with heating them. Then we'll move on to heating the milk. I've got all my milk. I'm doing a 4-gallon recipe. All of my milk is now in my pot. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the heat. And I like to heat my milk up at a medium flame. Some people would advise that you heat the milk at a lower heat, but I feel that if I'm paying attention to the milk pot and I'm stirring it gently and regularly, I'm not that worried about heating it at a slightly warmer temperature. I think the main risk is, one, that you would forget about the milk and then scorch it, which would be a tragedy. But if you're right there, it's probably not going to happen. So the milk gently heats. Let's say it takes about 10 to 20 minutes to get it up to temperature. The milk is heated up. It's ready to go. I want to just make sure before I get going that one of my trustiest instruments of cheese making is working properly. That's my thermometer. The way I check if it's working properly is I calibrate it by sticking it in a glass of ice water. I've set the ice in there for about 2 or 3 minutes beforehand. And I want to make sure that the thermometer reads 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And it does. That means my thermometer is reading accurately. That's good because over here, I want to make sure that I'm adding cultures. That's the next step of my cheddar making process. I want to make sure I'm adding those cultures when the milk is the correct temperature. If the thermometer was reading 10 degrees cold or 10 degrees hot, I would add the cultures at not the prime temperature point. So there we go. The pot of milk is 86 degrees. So we're ready to take the next step in our cheddar recipe. Just to reiterate, all we've done so far, we've cleaned the pot, cleaned the utensils, carefully added the cold milk to the pot. I'm doing a 4-gallon recipe. And then gently, while stirring regularly, you don't have to stir continuously, brought it up to 86 degrees. I made sure that it was really 86 degrees by calibrating my thermometer with some ice water. At 86 degrees, we are going to add the cultures. So cultures are they're this word we hear a lot, cheese cultures, but most people don't really know what cultures are. Cultures are any microorganisms that we put into the milk to cause the milk to ferment, to change, to transition from milk to not milk or soured milk or cheese. Today's cultures for the cheddar recipe are, well, I brought 2 options. I have my favorite easy beginning home cheesemakers culture option, which is just some simple buttermilk. It's cultured buttermilk that I got from the grocery store. I made sure to get it recently. I just bought it yesterday, actually. which is to say, don't use the buttermilk that you've had hanging out in the back of your fridge for 3 weeks or 4 months. Also, don't use the powdered buttermilk that you might have stored in your cupboard. Just get some fresh, cultured buttermilk. Make sure you read the word cultured on the package. So this is one cheese culture option, but there are other cheese culture options. Most commercial creameries don't go to the store and buy buttermilk in order to culture their cheese. They go through the cheese-making supply company, which stocks cultures from laboratories. I'll go get mine out of the freezer right now. Okay, so here are examples of cultures that come from cheese supply companies, cheese supply clearinghouses, warehouses. These are cultures, bacteria, that are arguably fairly identical or similar to the bacteria that are in the buttermilk. The difference being that buttermilk is sort of a simple, generic starting collection of bacteria to use as a cheese culture. The stuff that I get from the cheese-making supply companies, and I'll go over where those companies are shortly. These ones are a little more specific. I can go online and find cultures that give me very quick acid production or have gas production that creates the eye holes that you know in Swiss. I can select cultures that give me a more profound buttery flavor, or cultures that just complement the work of another culture. So going online and ordering the freeze-dried cultures is definitely opening up Pandora's box. You're gonna have more options than you could ever believe. So that's why I recommend, if you're just starting to make cheese, you just go with cultured buttermilk. Today, I'm gonna show you how I add both so that you can take either road. Now I'll show you how to first add buttermilk to the warmed milk. It's not that hard. You probably already figured out how to do it. 4 tablespoons of fresh buttermilk goes into my 86-degree milk. Just do that now. After I've added the buttermilk, I do my magical cheesemaker stir, which is like this. I bring the stir down through and I gently pull up. I imagine that I'm making a Ferris wheel shape. Just gently stir the buttermilk in, no biggie. Alternatively, I might want to get fancy with my laboratory-produced cheese cultures. Some examples of ones that I can use for my cheddar or Monterey Jack recipe include MM100. It's a funny nomenclature for cheese cultures. So if you go online to the cheese suppliers and start to poke around and think, that is a strange word, I don't really remember, I don't get what MM100 means, just know that everybody's a little bit confused as to why cheese cultures are labeled and named the way they are. So just know MM100, that's an example of a general beginning cheese culture that you could use in place of the buttermilk. Another one that I like for cheddar making, Monterey Jack, is the MA4000 series. So if I wasn't using buttermilk, instead using these freeze-dried cultures, I'll show you with the MM, what I would do, I take the packet right out of the freezer. When it's in the freezer, I make sure that it's rolled down as tightly as possible. I often seal it with a clip and I store it in an airtight Ziploc bag as possible. That's because these cultures, and here I'll show you what they look like, right? They're pretty dusty. Looks a little bit like cream of wheat or powdered milk. If these get wet or humid, they're gonna come alive. Right now they're in a dormant state, and that's good. I don't want them to be awake. I don't want them to be active until they get into the milk where I want them to do their thing. So when you're storing them, just do your best to get as much of that air out and to store them in as dry a place. Well, of course, your freezer is as dry as it can be, but in a Ziploc bag to try and seal out some of the moisture. So when I'm ready to use them, they come out of the freezer with my dry, clean spoon. I go ahead, not over the vat, because I don't want the steam from the warm milk to start to humidify, to start to moisten these dried cultures. So away from the vat, I measure out approximately 1/4 to a 1/2 teaspoon of cultures. And then I don't want them to fall as a clump onto the milk. I want them to kind of shake gently, spread out as best as possible over the surface of the milk. Can you see how I'm doing that? Just like that. Oop, low clump at the end. After I've shaken the cultures over the surface of the milk, I pause a moment. Take that moment to put my cultures back in the freezer. And this pause is allowing the freeze-dried, dehydrated cultures to wake up. You can see if you can get really close, it's almost like the crystals are melting on the surface of the milk. That's just what I want. If I started to stir immediately after shaking them over the surface of the milk, they would start to form these little dry clumps. Like if you imagine shaking cocoa over cold milk, how it would clump instead of actually mixing. If I pause for a minute, they moisten, they start to dissolve, and then when I come back and stir gently, they perfectly incorporate and mix thoroughly throughout the milk. So I'll just wait 30 more seconds and then go ahead and stir them in. So again, I'm doing that gentle stir. Here, I'll do it outside the milk so you can see what I'm actually doing. If this is the milk vat, I'm stirring like this. And specifically, I'm not whisking the milk because I don't want it to get frothy. And I'm not bringing the stir up into the air to make bubbles or to bring oxygen into the milk. I'm keeping it kind of submerged. That minimizes the amount of oxygen that goes into the pot. And why that's important is the bacteria that I just added, they don't want too much oxygen. They'd be happy with not much or none at all, but they're okay with a little bit. Adding more oxygen to the vat or the pot slows down what they're going to do, which is work for me, make my milk into cheese. Okay, perfect. We've inoculated the warm milk. I'm going to take my lid, cover it up, and I'm going to let this pot rest or ripen for about an hour to an hour and a half. So see you in a bit. We're now returning to our cheddar, our baby jack, Monterey jack recipe, and ready for the next step. Just to remind you what we've done so far, we've warmed the milk, we inoculated it. I showed you how to inoculate it with either buttermilk or a freeze-dried culture, for example, MM100. The next step after those cultures sat in the milk for about an hour to an hour and a half is we're going to add 2 ingredients which are fairly unique to cheese making, especially the rennet. Before the rennet, we're going to add calcium chloride. Calcium chloride is something that you have to add if you are working with pasteurized milk. You do not have to add calcium chloride if you are working with raw milk or milk that's been pasteurized at its minimum pasteurization level of 145 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're working on a farm and you are wondering if you need to add calcium chloride or not, just think about what temperature you pasteurize the milk at, if you pasteurized it at all, and then you'll know if you need to add calcium chloride. For city cheesemakers, for hobbyists, home hobbyists, urban cheesemakers, you probably are going to add calcium chloride to this recipe. And if you aren't sure, you should just go ahead and add it. What calcium chloride does is it corrects for some of the damage that takes place to the milk proteins when the milk is pasteurized. What happens is proteins in their natural state you can imagine it like a kush ball, a cluster of all these proteins. And when pasteurization happens, some of the charges, the positive electrical charges on the edge of this kush ball fall off. The problem with that is when I then add the rennet has its effect only because of those charges on the edges of the proteins. So let me show you how to add calcium chloride. It's very easy. I store this bottle, by the way, in a cool, dark place in my house. It lasts me forever because I don't add very much, and it's not very expensive. I probably paid, I'm thinking $10 or $15 for this entire liter. So what I'd like to do is measure out 3/4 of a cup. I like to measure with a medicine dropper. It seems to me a little bit more accurate than measuring with my measuring spoons. If you don't have a medicine dropper, measuring spoons will be fine. So here's 3/4 of a cup, of a teaspoon, 3/4 of a teaspoon of calcium chloride going into my vat of ripened milk. And I'm going to go ahead and stir that calcium chloride in. By the way, this milk has been sitting for, over an hour, and I can smell that something's changing. It's starting to smell buttery and like just a little bit yogurty, just very subtly. Smells excellent. So I'm stirring in my calcium chloride, doing my same gentle stir. And while the calcium chloride is moving through the vat, I'm going to go ahead and get my rennet ready. So the calcium chloride is in the milk. I'm going to go ahead and add the rennet. The calcium chloride needs to go in before the rennet, but you don't have to wait long before adding the rennet. Meaning it can be a minute, it can be 3 minutes, it can be 5 minutes, all's well. So the amount of calcium chloride I add is going to be the same as the amount of rennet I add. So I added 3/4 of a teaspoon of calcium chloride to my 4-gallon vat. This is for the cheddar jack. I keep using so many words. Monterey jack, cheddar jack, baby jack, you get the idea. It's a beginning cheddar recipe. Here's my measurement of 3/4 of a teaspoon of rennet. And now this is an important moment. Before I add this rennet, I want to think, is the temperature, is the flame off under the pot? Yes. Did I add my active cultures and were they given proper amount of time to ripen? Yes. Did I want to add anything else to the milk like annatto or calcium chloride? Check. Okay, so if everything's in place, the temperature is good, should be still around 86 degrees. Perfect. Then I can go ahead and add my rennet. Add it fairly quickly, and then I stir it in fairly quickly. So I'm going to give myself 10 to 15 strokes to move that rennet throughout the vat. And I'm also glancing at the clock. This is minute 1. So my rennet goes in, stir it in. Now here's an important point. I want to stop the motion of the milk. This is the Zen art of cheese making. I use my stirrer to just calm that milk right down. I don't want it moving. I don't want it turbulent once the rennet goes in. So I've looked at the clock. Good. I want to wait about 30 minutes, so I want to know when to start the timer. I've added the rennet, mixed it in, and then counter-stirred so that it stopped moving. And now I am going to see the milk transforming. One way I actually enjoy seeing the milk transform is sometimes I'll take a cap of the milk carton, and initially the milk cap will scoot across the surface of the milk freely. That's because right now the milk is still really milk. It's like the way the milk is when it comes out of the animal, out of the udder. But given a little bit of time, this magical ingredient, rennet, is going to cause the milk to transform from liquid to solid. And the way it's going to do that is it's going to cause those proteins, the proteins which we helped a little bit by adding the calcium chloride, it's going to cause those proteins to start to link together. So usually I start to see a change, could be around 4 minutes, could be around 8 minutes. The amount of time that passes between adding the rennet and your first clues that it no longer is really liquid is known as the flocculation point. That's a way that more professional cheesemakers will often calculate how much time to wait before cutting the curds. For beginning cheesemakers, if this is your first recipe, I would say it's okay to take the simple road and just calculate how long to wait before cutting the curds based on the clock. So only 5 minutes have passed. Well, we'll say 6, 5.5. And look at that. That cap doesn't want to glide across the surface of the milk. Say 6 minutes it took from the adding of the rennet to the point at which the milk no longer was exactly liquid, the flocculation point. That's great. I'm going to put the lid on and come back to this pot in 24 minutes. We were doing 30, we're already 6 down. So we're back, 30 minutes have passed, and I want to check how the vat looks. Let's see. First of all, I like to sneak in, see if I get a whiff of something good. It's warm and buttery. Let's see how that cap looks. Hey, something's changed around here. So I'm trying to push that lid across the surface of the milk, but people, something's going on here. This is definitely not milk anymore. This is definitely something transitioning into cheese. Look at that. Oops. Look at that. Pretty cool. All right, my next step is to cut the curd. This is essentially a big pot full of curd. To cut the curd, I like to use this cake spatula, the flat one, not the offset. And what I want to do to cut the curd is I want to basically break down this whole pot into as uniform sized pieces as I can. So ideally those would probably be squares, but I don't know how you get perfectly uniform squares out of a cylindrical vat. So let's just say it's going to be a little imperfect, but that's okay. Know that the goal is to have as closely, as uniform sized curds as possible. Okay, so to cut the curd, there are really 2 ways I can cut the curd. The first is that I could do vertical cuts and then go this way. So that essentially makes a grid of columns. A more effective way would actually be to cut at a 45-degree angle in 4 different directions. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense for you, don't worry. There are spatially oriented people out there that understand that, and I'm actually not one of them. My students have told me that. So I'm going to cut it the easier way, which is just to make some columns. The distance between the cut lines is going to affect what the final cheese is going to be. So I want to cut the curd so that there's about 3/4 of an inch between the cut lines. I'm actually going to just, sorry to have this angle because you can see the, I can try it the other. So I've already made the cuts all the way to the bottom in one direction. I'm going to turn my handles. My handles help me create my compass so I can know where north and south are. Now I'm going to cut the other direction. So what's happening? Can you see this pot? It's definitely not milk anymore. But what's this liquid stuff that's kind of gathering at the cuts and at the corners? Any guesses? That's right, it's whey. These are curds and this is whey. And what we need to do to keep cutting down the curds and whey is somehow figure out a way to do some horizontal cuts. Like I said, this is going to be imperfect. We just do our best. This is how I make my horizontal cuts. Just kind of slice. And do the same on the other side. The distance that I'm going down in theory is the same as the distance between the cut lines. Right now, the curds are pretty darn soft. They feel to me like silken tofu. As soon as I've done some general rough horizontal cutting and some rough vertical cutting, I do what's called the healing period, where I just wait. What's happening right now is that the curds are sort of shrinking in unto themselves. And this is why. When the curd was uncut, it had even pressure throughout the whole vat. But as soon as I made a cut line, it's as though this tightly packed cube of curd packed with water was right next to an opening. The water, or the whey, naturally just wants to move to the place of less pressure. So the whey is naturally, as I'm waiting during the healing period, going to just weep out of the curd slightly, not significantly. This is good for me to do that little pause because a little bit of shrinking together of the curd is going to allow the curd to be just a little firmer as I begin to stir. Why is that important? Well, my goal as a cheesemaker is to maximize my yield, my return. So if I'm a farmer, I've worked really hard for these 4 gallons of milk. I don't want to lose potential cheese. If I wait 2 minutes for that healing period, letting those curds pull back in on themselves just slightly, when I start to stir, break off less little tiny specks of the curd because it's harder, it's firmer, it's got more character. And so less cheese, less potential cheese is lost in the whey. Okay, healing period over. Can you see how the vat already looks different? It's kind of amazing. It just like transforms before your very eyes. My next step is to get all the curds into motion. I do that just by gently working my way to the bottom of the vat. Initially, I can't stir aggressively because if I stir aggressively, what's going to happen is little bits are going to break off and end up in the whey. And later, when I put those curds and whey into a form, little bits down the drain. So here we go. Just gently, initially, starting to shift these curds. I'm moving them, as well as when I need to, I'm doing some side cutting with my stirring tool. So I'm just going to do this. It takes me about 5 to 10 minutes to get all the curds into motion. You can see. Like that, cut. If you get to this point and you start to do this step and your curds don't look so bouncy and beautiful, I know what's wrong. It's your milk. If your curds start to shatter, meaning as you move them, they just kind of bust apart and start to create what looks essentially like ricotta floating around in milk in the whey, that's that the milk you used was pasteurized at really high temperatures. Those really high temperatures denatured the proteins so much that when you added rennet, they were too weak to really grab each other tightly enough to form a firm curd. If that happens, don't despair, but probably you're never going to end up with a solid, firm wheel of cheddar jack. What you'll end up with is probably a more modest basket of like farmer's cheese. Don't throw it away. Just make use of it. Next time, use another brand of milk. You can see I'm picking up my speed just slightly because there's more whey or water that's been released giving my spoon more mobility. So here's something that's interesting. If I want to make a cheese that is a moister cheese, like in your mind's eye, imagine like a Havarti or a young Gouda. If I want more moisture so that when I eat it, it's kind of smooth and chewy, I should make those initial cut lines farther apart because a softer cheese has more moisture. When I make those cut lines, I'm allowing the moisture to escape. If there's less cuts, less moisture escapes, I get a softer cheese. Incidentally, I also get a cheese which is not great for aging too long because the more moisture you have in your cheese, the shorter the potential aging period, which is fine. Not all cheeses are meant to be the exact same cheese, be the same. Also, not all cheeses are meant to be aged for 2 years. Many cheeses are fantastic eaten at 3 months. As you get a grip on cheese making, as you become more comfortable with how the curds should look, you can start tinkering with your recipe. You can start cutting the curd initially more finer or less fine. You can start, when you are at the cooking and stirring stage, as we are, cooking the curds more or cooking the curds less in order to have more or less moisture in your final cheese. If this is your first cheese recipe though, take it easy on yourself. Just make it through and feel good about that. Don't get too caught up in the specifics of each cheese recipe and how you can make every cheese in the cheese section. Just make any cheese. So there we go. The curds, they're still very soft. I would still say they have the texture of silken tofu, but they're firming up a little bit. They have a little more integrity. They're not just a blob of jello or jelly-like substance in the vat. They're starting to look like, you know, not quite Wisconsin cheese curds, firm, chewy, but they're on the road there. At this point, I can stir the vat freely. You can see what I'm doing, which means it's ready to be put back on the heat. You don't actually have to take it physically off the stove. Ready to put back on the heat, and we're moving now onto the phase which is called the cooking phase. The cooking phase is the step at which we apply heat while stirring. You don't want to not stir because otherwise the cheese at the bottom will burn and you'll miss the point of what you're doing. The point of what you're doing is you're trying to dehydrate this curd. By applying heat and keeping it in motion, you're essentially allowing the whey to be flung out of the curd while it shrinks in on itself. That's what you want. So let's put this on the heat. Now putting on the heat, and I'm going to put it on, I'll start with a medium-low temperature, but what's important to me at this point is to check how the temperature is progressing. I don't want I don't want these curds to heat up too quickly, and I don't want them to heat up too slowly because I'd get a little bored. I want them to grow from what they are now, which is 86 degrees Fahrenheit. I want them to come up to 95, so that's 9 degrees, over the course of about 30 to 40 minutes. That whole time, I'm stirring. If I see the temperature jump forward too quickly, like let's just say I put my thermometer in and oh my gosh, it's 92 degrees, kill the heat. If I find that 35 minutes have passed and I've only gone up 3 degrees, turn the heat higher. So you just have to figure out what works for you and your stove. Okay, it's been about 40 minutes and the vat is 95 degrees, so we raised it about 9 degrees. I'm going to turn the heat down just a little bit more, and for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to stir it to 102. These temperatures they're ballpark, meaning if you end up at 101.9 in 14 minutes, not a problem. If you found yourself at 95 degrees and it took you 45 minutes, that's okay. The goal is that, as I said earlier, you're gradually increasing the temperature of the vat. You don't want to spike up. You also don't want to go so slowly that you fall asleep. So 15 more minutes, 102. That's our goal. Okay, 15 more minutes and 102.3 means I'll turn off the heat. And now comes the long, slow stretch of your cheese making, which is 40 to 45 minutes of just stirring. As a reminder, what's happening during this 45-minute period and what was happening in the previous 45-minute period is we're dehydrating the curds. So you can see they already look super different than when they first cut them. Check this out. I mean, talk about shrunk down, right? I want to keep shrinking them, and I want to drive that whey out of the curds so that my cheese is dry enough that I can age it a little bit. As I said before, when you get a grip on your cheese recipe and you want to tinker with it, maybe you'll find you don't want to stir it another 45 minutes because maybe you want a really fresh white cheese that's good to eat in about 3 weeks. That's okay too. For now, I'll stick to the recipe. 45 minutes. This is when I really start to daydream. It's been 45 minutes and I think the cheese is getting close to done. Here's one of the ways I can tell. One is it's smelling just the tiniest bit more sour in a good way, like yogurty. The next way I can tell, in addition to the smell, is when I put my clean hand in the vat and swirl it around. These little curds bounce off the side of my hand, just like tennis balls. So they've grown firm and tough. Look at this. They're like squishy and spongy. They stay together if I squish them together, but then they'll break apart. That's the texture I'm looking for. So we're ready. The next step that we take is what's called pitching the curds. Pitching means I just simply stop stirring and I wait 5 minutes. What's happening during that 5 minutes is all those curds which have been in motion are sinking to the bottom of the vat. That's helpful for me because the next step is to separate the curds in the whey. If I have them all mixed up together, I'm in a worse spot than if they already naturally separate out and I can just pour most of the whey off. So 5 minutes, let's wait. Okay, so we've waited 5 minutes. We're now ready to move the curds out of the vat. I'm going to prepare the form that I'm using so that when the curds come out, they can go right into what's going to contain them as a wheel to make them into a wheel. I'm going to show you the simplest, most wonderful home version, which is just a piece of cheesecloth. That's going to make me this rustic, maybe slightly asymmetrical wheel that has some wrinkles leading into a central belly button. You can imagine that cheese shape in your mind's eye. If you want a perfectly round, symmetrical cheese, you are very welcome to purchase fancier, more complex cheese molds or cheese forms. For example, here's one. The curds will come out of the vat, fall into this mesh liner, which sits in this firmer plastic form, and here's the follower that goes on top. I'm going to create essentially the same thing using a piece of cheesecloth. I recommend a piece of cheesecloth for getting going because it costs $1 versus maybe $80. Before I use my cheesecloth, I'm just going to go and rinse it. As I said, I'm going to go ahead and rinse it. I like to boil my cheesecloth briefly for about 2 minutes just to make sure it's super clean before the brand new fresh curds go into it. Let me go do that. So here's my cleaned piece of cheesecloth. I didn't really talk about cheesecloth, but cheesecloth can mean a couple of different things. If you're thinking of cheesecloth that you find in the store that has a really wide weave, don't use that. I want a cheesecloth for my cheese making that's a much, much finer weave. It's called grade 60 or grade 90. Often it's sold as butter muslin. That's what you want. If you are a scavenger and you like to repurpose things, it's totally okay to use a sheet or a patch of fabric that you had around the house. Just two things. Make sure it's really clean. Again, boiling it will help you get there. Make sure the weave is loose enough and tight enough. Here if you could see the sunshine through this, you could see, I can see through it, but not too easily. The last thing is I recommend that the cloth you use to make this wheel of cheddar jack is white or very lightly colored. So you might think, oh, I have all this old linen that's printed blue and black. Don't use that for cheese making because you don't know if the dyes will leach into the cheese and give you a strange molten cheese that you didn't want. Okay, here's my clean cheesecloth. Here's a colander. I'm just gonna set the colander. Ideally, I would set it over a sink. Just for the video, I'm gonna demo it here at this big bin. Cheesecloth. Before I actually get the curds into this basket, this cheese form, this cheesecloth, there's one more thing I'm gonna do. I've pitched the curds now for 5 minutes, which means all the curds have dropped down here to the bottom of the vat. To save myself time and also to save the whey, I'm just gonna ladle off as much whey as I can until I start seeing curds in it into another pot. I'm gonna use this to make ricotta. As I'm trying to drain off this whey over here to this ricotta vat, I can grab some of those loosey-goosey curds as they sneak out by just holding a small basket or colander over the ricotta vat. There's some sneakers. A little bit more. Almost there. Okay, just throw these back in the vat. To save myself time, I'm gonna go back to this recipe, but I'm just gonna go ahead and turn the heat on this one. And now get a load of that. Beautiful, right? Don't have to do that much, just pour it off. It's gonna wanna splash. So I'm gonna drain, this is called a pre-drain really. I'm gonna get the whey separated from the curds. Just let it drain, not even a minute. And then I'm gonna put the curds back into this pot because I'm gonna add the salt. So right now, just for fun, I'm gonna taste it. Oh, funny. It's making this squeaky sound against my tooth, like as though I'm chewing on a rubber band. Huh. That tells me that we're on track, tells me that the pH is dropping and we're no longer sweet milk. We're definitely now reaching the realm of soured cheese, which is a good thing. That's why cheese is safer than milk, because it's got all this acid that's been produced by the cultures. Here's my slightly pre-drained curds. Going to go back in the main pot. You can squeeze them a little bit. The next step is salting. before I do this, I'll just put this back in my other pot. Okay, so salt. My favorite salt to use when making cheese is kosher salt. I always use kosher salt, but sometimes I also use sea salt. People ask me if they can use fancy salts like pink salt. I say you can, but the truth is we're gonna use a lot of salt and it's not gonna, most of it's gonna be wasted as it drains away out of the cheese. So this is a good time to use bulkier salt. Let me go get my kosher. Now we're at the phase when we're gonna add the salt. You can see I've drained the curd. There's a little whey still in the bottom, don't worry about it. And we're gonna add the kosher salt. I'm adding the kosher salt. You can use sea salt, but I really always use this kosher salt. I really like it. I'm gonna measure out a cup, although a cup is gonna be a rough measurement because you are really gonna have to just taste the curds and make sure that they get salty enough. That's always been my best measure, is just how do they taste. I'm gonna add the salt in 3 different passes. So a third of it, a third of it, a third of it. Here goes my first third. And now the salt's over the top. I'm gonna just break open those curds like this, because I want that salt to hit all those surfaces. I'm just gonna mix it for a little while. Get that salt in there. See, it's chunky, breaking it down back down into the curds that it was. This is a version of cheddar that's called a stirred curd cheddar. It lacks the traditional cheddaring step, which is instead of crumbling the cheese with your hands like this, in traditional cheddaring, you take that big block and you stack a bunch of those big blocks and you flip them, and then after a point you put the block itself like this through a machine that is a curd slicer that chops it up into French fry-like strips. Those that come out of that traditional cheddaring process, those little French fry-like chunks, tater tot-like chunks, those are what Midwesterners know as cheese curds. So these are cheese curds here. They're just a different size. So if you love cheese curds with all your heart, make this recipe. And maybe don't break the curds up into such fine bits. Keep them bigger. If you have any Midwestern friends or Canadian friends, people that like poutine near you, if you make this cheese for them, they will love you forever and ever. It's really a favorite of some cheese lovers. This is one of my favorite parts. Well, obviously I have a lot of favorite parts of cheese making, but this is a really fun one. It's so tactile. Just like got my hands in this, my clean hands, in this vat full of springy, warm, slightly salty, buttery scented cheese curds. Pretty good life. Getting a sense? Okay, here comes my second salting. As I add the salt is pulling more whey out of the curds. So I can see it, the bottom of the pot. It will be hard to show you, but there's like little bits of pools of whey at the bottom. That's the salt that's desiccating, dehydrating the curd even more. All right, another salting. Looks like so much salt. I mean, for people watching their salt, they don't even want to know what you just put into the cheese vat. But salt is essential. If you don't salt the curds properly, you're not going to make a food that is safe or that can be preserved. Salt is one of the main ways that we make cheese a safe food. Salt prohibits the growth of unwanted organisms, as well as shuts down those bacteria that we added earlier. So salt really regulates a big part of the cheese making process. Not only that, without enough salt, your cheese might taste a little flat. So I would say aim to oversalt just a little bit rather than undersalt initially, because you can always cut a smaller slice of cheese and dilute that saltiness by spreading it out over a salad. But if you don't have enough salt to begin with, your cheese might go off course and you might get some unwanted flavors and then you might not want to eat any of it. So salt sufficiently. Okay, I'm gonna take a taste of the salt. By the way, this again just feels like glory. It's like joy in the cheese vat. Like if you thought you loved cheese, you will double love cheese after you do this. So I'm gonna taste the saltiness. Ooh, that's salty. That's good. I'm wanting it to be just a little too salty. It tastes delicious. Add a little more salt till it becomes a little too salty. That's where we're at. Definitely salty, edible. I'm a medium salt lover. I'm not crazy like salting everything I eat. I also can't stand when things are undersalted. So I fall in the middle of the spectrum. This to me it's definitely salty. It ranks up there with like some salty olives, where you eat one and you're like, woo, that was salty, but still edible. Okay, now a fun, almost final phase moment. We're gonna move the curds into the colander, which we've lined with the clean, wet, pre-boiled cheesecloth. Again, when I'm doing this at home, I always do this over the sink just because it's splashy and wet, little curds here and there. You don't have to, but I just recommend it's a little bit easier. Can you see at the bottom of the vat all that way that the salt pulled out? Yeah? Yum, yum, yum. You could stop right here. You could just eat it. You don't really have to keep going. You could just invite your friends over, get the French fries going, get the gravy on, have yourself some homemade poutine. Okay, be right back, rinsing my hands for a second. I've got all the curds now into the form. I'm gonna bring the ends of this cloth together. I wanna make sure there's no like little loop hanging out down here where the curds will spill out. Bringing it together, and I'm just gonna twist. This is really gratifying. That's also a lot of the salt that I just put in leaving. So another example of, or another reason why over-salting is important. Okay, at this point, I have roughly a wheel with a little nub. What I want to do is I want to apply some pressure to the top. So maybe easier would be to show it on this cutting board. This ideally could be in the sink. I now want to put pressure on the top of this wheel for about 10 minutes. Here we go. Here we are. We've got all those curds contained within this piece of cheesecloth. I need to apply pressure pretty quickly because the curds are still warm. Now's the moment for them to fuse together, forming a complete wheel. If I wait too long and the curds get really cold, they'll never quite connect back together. So quickly, got to put this wheel under pressure, and I'm just going to think creatively about how to do that. Again, I would probably do this over the sink, but since I'm not over a sink, I'll just take a roasting tray, and so all the whey that's going to come out as I put the pressure on is going to be there, and I'm going to cover it. And this is actually one of my favorite funny home cheese pieces of equipment, 25-pound weight. I'm just gonna suspend it over the top, and then I'm gonna figure out how to hold that in place so that it doesn't fall down. But that's what I want. I don't want it to tip, but I'm gonna figure out how to do that. That's what I want. Pressure on the cheese, 10 minutes, and then we're gonna come back and flip it. Here we are with this beautiful wheel of cheese that just began its time pressing. It's been under this 25-pound weight for about 10 minutes. Now's the time to do its first flip. Watch this. Weight comes off. If you don't have a weight like this, you're gonna have to get creative. Maybe it could be a big rock that you clean up, boil from the garden and put in the sink and shimmy into place with some pots and pans. Maybe you have a handyman or a handy woman in your life who could create some sort of press. Maybe you want to buy a commercial press. There's many on the market. This is just one quick idea to play with. So here, the cheese that was just 10 minutes ago, curds floating around in whey, got salted, got put into the cleaned cheesecloth, and I want to do a first flip, and here's why. If I happen to have a fold of cloth, like I can kind of see it's happening there, a fold of cloth that goes deep into the cheese, it's going to work against what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to form a complete wheel that essentially has a skin all around the outside, a sealed skin. If I open it up, reshift the cloth, I'm going to be able to avoid getting some funny wrinkle in there that's going to work against the formation of the complete wheel. So there's my flip. Easy as pie. Do the same thing I did before. Twist it, get that weight back on top, and away we go. I want this cheese, I'm going to figure out a better setup for pressing it. I want this cheese to stay under pressure for the next 5 to 10 hours. You have a buffer zone there for how much time you spend pressing it. Probably the more the better if you want to age the cheese longer. So here we go, 10 hours of pressure. Here we are back with our cheddar jack. It's been pressing under this 25-pound gym weight for 10 hours. And you'll remember that yesterday we turned it from milk to milk gel, cut the gel into curds, stirred the curds while we cooked them, stirred them more. For about 2 hours I was standing at the stove cooking and stirring, and ultimately the curds were brought up to 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I pitched the curds, where I let the curds settle to the bottom of the vat, then poured off the whey, took those curds, poured them into a colander, let them drain for a minute, brought them back into the pot, added the salt in 3 or 4 different steps until the curds tasted really salty while I was crumbling, breaking up the curds, and then finally poured those salty curds into the cheesecloth lined colander and gathered the ends and twisted and then plopped it into some sort of setup where pressure could be applied evenly to the wheel. I made sure that I flipped that wheel about 10 minutes in to make sure there weren't any deep fissures or deep wrinkles where the cheesecloth was lost inside the wheel. So let's see how the cheese looks. Removing the weight. Whoa. And, well, first of all, I was draining it on this roasting pan, which is a little bit of a make-it-work kitchen setup. So it did imprint the roasting pan on the backside. That doesn't bother me at all. I kind of like the personalized nature of homemade cheese, how it has a lot of character, how you can tell that it was made by hand. So opening up. Another thing to mention is most of the whey has drained off, so I'm feeling it's wet on the outside, but it's not dripping. And it feels pretty firm. I would say the texture reminds me of a pink eraser. Wow. Here we are. Beautiful. I mentioned yesterday that If you don't like this asymmetry or these wrinkles, you can always buy a nicer professional cheese form. Here's an example. Often they're made out of heavy-duty plastic, and they have a follower that allows you to apply pressure evenly on top of the wheel. I said, though, that for first-time cheesemakers, for people that don't want to do this professionally, just a piece of cheesecloth is an amazingly effective way to create a wheel of cheese out of a vat of milk. So here we are, our pressed, salted wheel of cheddar jack. Looks great to me. Some things I'm paying attention to are any of those wrinkles, they're not too deep. I don't want them so deep because if they're too deep, the molds that might grow on the surface as this cheese ripens would get deep in there and I wouldn't be able to remove them even if I was using, even if I had a brush and could brush it out. Too deep of a crack is not easy to clean. So examining the wheel, this looks just the way I want it to look. My next step is to prepare this cheese for aging. What I like to do is get a cheese mat. Here's an example of a cheese mat. You could use also, if you don't have one of these, you could use a good old embroidery mat from the craft store. You could also use a sushi mat if you don't have either of those two things. What you want is a way that your cheese can rest at room temperature for roughly a day. During this time, what's happening is the skin is drying slightly, the rind, the skin, the rind. And that helps so that the cheese seals just a little bit more. I like to let my cheese sit at room temperature in a way that it can breathe all around on all parts of the wheel. It sits for a day and dries. This is the drying phase. And why it's important is that gives a little bit more time for that rind to tighten up, close up. And that is what enables a cheese to be aged. If you have a wheel of cheese that has openings or cracks or ways that it's not completely sealed, you really can't age it. And the reason is that those cracks or imperfections in the rind are places where unwanted molds will get inside the cheese and ruin it. Conversely, those cracks or openings are also places where moisture, which you want a minimum amount inside the cheese, are going to escape. So the formation of a complete closed rind is really important for aged cheeses. It's what enables you to go forward with a protected interior. During the one day of drying, I often just take a piece of cheesecloth and cover the cheese. That's because I don't want dust or yeast, anything flying around in the air to land on the cheese. I want it to dry out and stay clean. A day has passed of this cheddar drying in my little drying setup. I'm now ready to do my final act, which is get the cheddar jack into a cave or a way that it can age. What I like to do for my aging setup is to place the cheese inside a closed, clean box. This is just any old box you can find at most general stores. Inside the box, I make sure to have at least one aging mat on the bottom so that as moisture gathers in the box as the cheese is sitting in there, the cheese doesn't sit in its own puddle. So here's how I'm going to be aging my cheese. And after this day has passed, the surface of the skin, it feels not even really damp anymore. It's almost dry to the touch. If you were to wait too long, let your cheese go through the drying phase for 3 days on accident, the problem could be that the rind, the skin will start to crack. So it's important that you just give it a minimal amount of time to dry, then get it into its aging box. And it's important that in the aging box, it can have a little bit of air circulating on all sides. So with the cap on, and you can buckle it down airtight, this cheese is ready to age. I always like to put a Post-it or a piece of tape telling me what cheese it is, when I made it, and when I can expect that it's done, because I lose track of my cheeses really easily. So that's an essential thing for a smart cheesemaker to do. This cheese could live in Not a real cave, but a real cheese cave. By that, I mean some sort of cool environment that stays steadily in the range of 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a little bit warmer than your fridge, but it's definitely cooler than room temperature. If I was to leave this box out on the counter, the cheese might taste okay, but it very likely would go bad. If I put it in the fridge, as I've recommended, that's okay too. All that does is slows down the aging process significantly. So your cheese will be ready in 5 months instead of 2 or 3. If you don't have a steadily cool 50-degree basement that's rat and rodent free, and if you don't have space in your regular fridge to store a bin worth of cheese, an easy solution is that you can buy a wine fridge which has the ability to control the temperature. You could also buy what's called an analog thermostat. That's a little apparatus that you connect to your fridge, not your everyday fridge, but an additional fridge. And that analog thermostat enables you to put the temperature just a little bit warmer. So wine fridge or analog thermostat or consistently cool basement or regular fridge are 4 options for places where your aging cheese can live. Now, during the aging process, which can last anywhere from a day, you could eat the cheese right now, to a couple of months, I recommend that you age this jack about 3 months at 55 degrees. What you need to do on a regular basis, as in twice a week, is open up that box. That allows air to come in and other gases to leave. And you want to flip the cheese so the top becomes the bottom. This is an important move because water and whey is draining downwards, so the bottom's always going to be wetter and the top is always going to be drier. So continuously flipping is going to make sure the moisture is evenly distributed. Another thing that I like to do to control how the rind develops is I like to create a classic rub for cheddar jack. To make that rub, it's really easy. Just take some oil. I often use olive oil. We'll say about a 1/4 cup. Just do a mini example here. Traditionally, you would add chili powder in about equal proportion to cocoa. If you wanted, for extra color, you could add a drop or 2 of annatto. Annatto is a cheese colorant. You don't have to use this. It only would give a brighter orange color to the rind. Your chili will give a lot of orange color as well. Stir up your slurry. I like to make the slurry in extra small batches because I don't really like to hang on to it. It's a place where mold could grow. I'd rather just have a tiny batch, which I use up within the week, and then make new stuff. So here's my slurry. Here's my fresh cheddar jack. I'm just gonna have some fun rubbing the surface of the rind. So once or twice a week when I visit the cheese to give it a flip, what I like to do is just add a little bit of this colorant and oil to the rind and use that, 1, for the aesthetic, but 2, just to give a little lubrication. So as I'm rubbing, it's easy to rub, and anything that wants to be growing on the rind, it's going to get rubbed away. You can see here how this is going to make a beautiful effect on the wheel. Also a little bit messy. That rubbed wheel goes into its box. The lid goes on. The cheese goes into its cave, and away you go. Your cheese is ready to eat when you want to eat it, but this recipe tends to be at peak goodness between 3 and 5 months. Oh, and there's one last thing. If this whole rub is a little complicated, you don't have the aging mat, you don't have the bin, you don't really have the fridge space, there's an easy out. You can just take your cheese and vacuum seal it in a food saver bag and store it in the fridge, and you can age it in that way indefinitely. In this way, you don't have to worry about the molds. You barely have to worry about the flipping. It's really, really easy. The downside, it's not quite as pretty, and you might not get quite as much flavor. Tuck those loose ends around so that it forms a more compact blob. Also, what's happening, you can see, is this shiny, beautiful outer skin is forming. And here's how I make a ball.